Mother died today, or maybe yesterday. I can't be sure. The telegram from the home says, "Your mother passed away. Funeral tomorrow. Deep sympathy." Which leaves the matter doubtful. It could have been yesterday. When we lived together, Mother was always watching me, but we hardly ever talked. During her first few weeks at the home, she used to cry a good deal, but that was only because she hadn't settled down. After a month or two, she'd have cried if she'd been told to leave the home, because this, too, would have been a wrench. That was why, during the last year, I seldom went to see her. Also, it would have meant losing my Sunday, not to mention the trouble of going to the bus, getting my ticket, and spending 2 hours on the journey each way.
We put the lid on, but I was told to unscrew it when you came, so that you could see her.
While he was going up to the coffin, I told him not to trouble. He put back the screwdriver in his pocket and stared at me. I realized then that I shouldn't have said no, and it made me rather uncomfortable. The old people, Mother's friends, were coming in. He went out and brought a coffee pot and a few cups. I was feeling very comfortable. The coffee had warmed me up, and through the open door came scents of flowers and breaths of cool air. I think I dozed off for a while. Now, the sun was up and the sky was molten red. A morning breeze was blowing, and it had a pleasant, salty tang. There was the promise of a very fine day. Caught myself thinking what an agreeable walk I could have had if it hadn't been for Mother.
Is it your mother we're burying?
Yes.
What was her age?
Well, she was getting on. As a matter of fact, I didn't know exactly how old she was. And I can remember the look of the church, the villagers in the street, the red geraniums on the graves, the tawny red earth pattering on Mother's coffin. Then more people, voices, the wait outside a cafe for the bus, the rumble of the engine, and my little thrill of pleasure when we entered the first brightly lit streets of Algiers, and I pictured myself going straight to bed and sleeping 12 hours. Getting up was an effort, as I'd been really exhausted by the previous day's experiences. I wondered how to spend the morning, and decided that a swim would do me good, so I caught the streetcar that goes down to the harbor. It was quite like old times. A lot of young people were in the ocean, amongst them Marie Cardona, who used to be a typist at the office. I was rather keen on her in those days, and I fancy she liked me too, but she was with us so short a time that nothing came of it. I asked her if she'd come to the movies with me that evening. She laughed and said yes if I'd take her to the comedy everybody was talking about. Another man who lives on my floor came in from the street. The general idea hereabouts is that he's a pimp. But if you ask him what his job is, he says he's a warehouseman. One thing's sure, he isn't popular in our street. His name is Raymond.
Look here, how about having some grub with me? I have a black pudding and some wine.
It struck me that this would save my having to cook my dinner, so I said thanks very much. He told me he had been having a rough house with a fellow who'd annoyed him.
I'm not the one who looks for trouble, only I'm a bit short-tempered. The fellow said to me, "Come down off that streetcar if you're a man." I says, "You keep quiet, I ain't done nothing to you." Then he said I hadn't any guts. Well, that settled it. I got down off that streetcar and said to him, "You better keep your mouth shut, or I'll shut it for you." "I'd like to see you try," says he. Then I gave him one across the face, and laid him out good and proper. He was bleeding like a pig when I was done with him. There's a girl behind it, as usual. We slept together pretty regular. I was keeping her, as a matter of fact, and she cost me a tidy sum. That fellow I knocked down is her brother.
He gave her enough money to keep her going, without extravagance, though. He paid the rent for her room and 20 francs a day for food.
But that wasn't enough for my fine lady. She was always grumbling that she couldn't make both ends meet with what I gave her. So one day I say to her, "Look here, why not get a job for a few hours a day? That's make things easier for me too. I bought you a new dress this month. I pay your rent and give you 20 francs a day, but you go and waste that money at the cafe with a pack of girls." But she wouldn't hear of working, though she kept on saying she couldn't make do with what I gave her. And then one day I found out she was doing me dirt.
He went on to explain that he's found a lottery ticket in her bag, and when he asked her where the money'd come from to buy it, she wouldn't tell him. Then, another time, he's found a pawn ticket for 2 bracelets that he's never set eyes on.
So I knew there was dirty work going on, and I told her I'd have nothing more to do with her. But first I gave her a good hiding.
He'd beaten her till the blood came. Before that, he's never beaten her.
This time I'm done with her. Only, to my mind, I ain't punished her enough. See what I mean?
He explained that it was about this he wanted my advice. He wanted to write her a letter, a real stinker, that'll get her on the raw, and at the same time make her repent for what she'd done. Then, when she came back, he'd go to bed with her, and just when she was properly primed up, he'd spit in her face and throw her out of the room. I agreed it wasn't a bad plan. It would punish her all right. But Raymond told me he didn't feel up to writing the kind of letter that was needed, and that was where I could help. When I didn't say anything, he asked me if I'd mind doing it right away, and I said no, I'd have a shot at it. I wrote the letter. It didn't take much trouble over it, but I wanted to satisfy Raymond, as I'd no reason not to satisfy him. Then I read out what I'd written. "Read it again, please," he said. He seemed delighted. "That's the stuff," he chuckled. "I could tell you was a brainy sort, old boy, and you know what's what." Marie said she was free next morning, so I proposed she should have luncheon with me. She asked me if I loved her. I said that sort of question had no meaning, really, but I supposed I didn't. She looked sad for a bit, but when we were getting our lunch ready, she brightened up and started laughing. It was just then that the row started in Raymond's room.
Your name?
Raymond gave his name. Meanwhile, the girl was sobbing and repeating, "He hit me, the coward. He's a pimp."
Excuse me, officer, but is that in order, calling a man a pimp in the presence of witnesses?
"That's enough," the policeman said, and told the girl to go away. Raymond was to stay in his room till summoned to the police station. I asked him how it had gone off. He said it had all gone quite smoothly at first, as per program. Only then she'd slapped his face and he'd seen red and started thrashing her. As for what happened after that, he didn't tell me, as I was there. "Well, you taught her a lesson all right, and that's what you wanted, isn't it?" He agreed and pointed out that whatever the police did, that wouldn't change the fact she'd had her punishment. Then Raymond said that what he really wanted was for me to act as his witness. I told him I had no objection, only I didn't know what he expected me to say.
It's quite simple. You've only got to tell them that the girl had let me down.
So I agreed to be his witness. Raymond invited me to spend next Sunday at the seaside just outside Algiers. I told him I'd be delighted.
It's like this. I've been shadowed all the morning by some Arabs. One of them's the brother of that girl that I had the row with. If you see him hanging around the house when you get back, pass me the word.
I promised to do so. Marie came that evening and asked me if I'd marry her. I said I didn't mind. If she was keen on it, we'd get married. Then she asked me again if I loved her. I replied, much as before, that her question meant nothing or next to nothing, but I supposed I didn't.
If that's how you feel, why marry me?
I explained that it had no importance really, but if it would give her pleasure, we could get married right away. Then she remarked that marriage was a serious matter, to which I answered no.
Suppose another girl had asked you to marry her. I mean, a girl you liked in the same way as you like me. Would you have said yes to her?
Naturally. Then she said she wondered if she really loved me or not. I, of course, couldn't enlighten her as to that. And after another silence, she murmured something about my being a queer fellow.
And I dare say that's why I love you, but maybe that's why one day I'll come to hate you.
To which I had nothing to say, so I said nothing. She thought for a bit, then started smiling and, taking my arm, repeated that she was in earnest. She really wanted to marry me. Just as we were starting for the bus stop, Raymond plucked my sleeve and told me to look across the street. I saw an Arab just standing there. He was staring at us silently, in the special way these people have, as if we were blocks of stone or dead trees. I insisted on going at once. Halfway to the bus stop, Raymond glanced back over his shoulder and said the Arab wasn't following. Raymond asked if I'd like to come with him for a stroll on the beach, so we went out together, the two of us. We went down to the water's edge and walked along it. I wasn't thinking about anything, as all that sunlight beating down on my bare head made me feel half asleep. At that moment, I noticed an Arab a long way down the beach, coming in our direction. I gave Raymond a look, and he nodded, saying, "That's him." Though the Arab walked slowly, he was much nearer already.
Listen, if there's a roughhouse, I'll tackle the fellow who's after me, and you stand by to get my back.
When we were only a few steps away, the Arab halted. I slowed down while Raymond went straight up to this man.
Just you watch. I ain't finished with him yet.
"Look out! He's got a knife!" Raymond went off to the doctor's while I was left behind. After a moment, I returned to the beach and started walking. As I slowly walked toward the boulders at the end of the beach, I could feel my temples swelling under the impact of the light, and each time I felt a hot blast strike my forehead. I gritted my teeth. I clenched my fists in my pockets and keyed up every nerve to fend off the sun and the dark befuddlement it was pouring into me. When I came nearer, I saw that Raymond's Arab had returned. On seeing me, the Arab raised himself a little, and his hand went to his pocket. Naturally, I gripped the revolver in mine. It struck me that all I had to do was to turn, walk away, and think no more about it. But the whole beach, pulsing with heat, was pressing on my back. The heat was beginning to scorch my cheeks. Beads of sweat were gathering in my eyebrows. It was just the same sort of heat as at my mother's funeral, and I had the same disagreeable sensations. I couldn't stand it any longer, and took a step forward. I knew it was a fool thing to do, and then the Arab drew his knife and held it up toward me. A shaft of light shot upward from the steel, and I felt as if a long, thin blade transfixed my forehead. I was conscious only of the symbols of the sun clashing on my skull, and less distinctly of the keen blade of light flashing up from the knife, scarring my eyelashes and gouging into my eyeballs. Then everything began to reel before my eyes. Every nerve in my body was a steel spring, and my grip closed on the revolver. The trigger gave, and the smooth underbelly of the butt jogged my palm. And so, with that crisp whip-crack sound, it all began. I knew I'd shattered the balance of the day, the spacious calm of this beach on which I had been happy. But I fired 4 shots more into the inert body, on which they left no visible trace, and each successive shot was another loud, fateful rap on the door of my undoing. I was questioned several times immediately after my arrest, but they were all formal examinations, as to my identity and so forth. At the first of these, which took place at the police station, nobody seemed to have much interest in the case. A week following my arrest, a lawyer came to my cell. He introduced himself and added that he'd perused the record of my case with the utmost care. His opinion was that it would need cautious handling, but there was every prospect of my getting off, provided I followed his advice. He said that they'd been making investigations into my private life. They had learned that my mother died recently in a home. Inquiries had been conducted, and the police informed that I had shown great callousness at my mother's funeral.
You must understand that I don't relish having to question you about such a matter, but it has much importance, and unless I found some way of answering the charge of callousness, I shall be handicapped in conducting your defense, and that is where you, and only you, can help me.
He went on to ask if I had felt grief on that sad occasion. I answered that, of recent years, I'd rather lost the habit of noting my feelings, and hardly knew what to answer. I could truthfully say I'd been quite fond of Mother, but really that didn't mean much. All normal people, I added as an afterthought, had more or less desired the death of those they loved at some time or another.
You must promise me not to say anything of that sort at the trial, or to the examining magistrate.
I promised to satisfy him, but I explained that my physical condition at any given moment often influenced my feelings. Anyhow, I could assure him of one thing, that I'd rather Mother hadn't died. Later in the day, I was taken again to the examining magistrate's office.
There are several things that puzzle me about your crime. I feel sure that you will help me understand them.
When I replied that really it was quite simple, he asked me to give him an account of what I'd done that day. As a matter of fact, I had already told him at our first interview, in a summary sort of way, of course, about Raymond, the beach, our swim, the fight, then the beach again, and the 5 shots I'd fired. He then asked me bluntly if I'd loved my mother. Yes, like everybody else.
Why did you fire 5 consecutive shots?
I thought for a bit, then explained that they weren't quite consecutive. I fired 1 at first, and then the other 4 after a short interval.
Why did you pause between the first and second shot? But why? Why did you go on firing at a prostrate man? I asked you why. I insist on you telling me. Do you know who this is?
Of course I do, I answered. He told me he believed in God, and that even the worst of sinners could obtain forgiveness of him. But first he must repent, and become like a little child, with a simple, trustful heart, open to conviction. I had great difficulty in following his remarks, as, for one thing, the office was so stifling hot and big flies were buzzing round and settling on my cheeks. Also because he rather alarmed me. He had drawn himself up to his full height and was asking me very earnestly if I believed in God. I said no. That was unthinkable, he said. All men believe in God, even those who reject him. Of this he was absolutely sure. If ever he came to doubt it, his life would lose all meaning.
Do you wish my life to have no meaning?
Really, I couldn't see how my wishes came into it, and I told him as much.
I, anyhow, am a Christian, and I pray him to forgive you for your sins. My poor young man, how can you not believe that he suffered for your sake?
As I usually do when I want to get rid of someone whose conversation bores me, I pretended to agree.
You see, now won't you own that you believe and put your trust in him? Never in all my experiences have I known a soul so case-hardened as yours. All the criminals who have come before me until now wept when they saw this symbol of our Lord's suffering.
In the same weary tone, he asked me a last question. Did I regret what I had done? After thinking, I said that what I felt was less regret than a kind of vexation. I couldn't find a better word for it, but he didn't seem to understand. The day on which my trial started was one of brilliant sunshine. My lawyer assured me the case would take only 2 or 3 days.
From what I hear, the court will dispatch your case as quickly as possible, as it isn't the most important one on the cause list.
The judge questioned me quite calmly and even, I thought, with a hint of cordiality. For the 100th time I was asked to give particulars of my identity. The judge then launched into an account of what I'd done, stopping after every 2 or 3 sentences to ask me, "Is that correct?" To which I always replied, "Yes, sir," as my lawyer had advised me. Why had I sent my mother to an institution? I replied that the reason was simple. I hadn't enough money to see that she was properly looked after at home. Then he asked if the parting hadn't caused me distress. I explained that neither mother nor I expected much of one another, or, for that matter, of anybody else, so both of us had got used to the new conditions easily enough. Next, the warden of the home was called to the witness box. He explained that I hadn't wanted to see Mother's body, or shed a single tear, and that I'd left immediately after the funeral ended, without lingering at her grave. Another thing had surprised him. The chaplain told him that I didn't know my mother's age. It was Marie's turn next. The judge asked her what were the relations between us, and she said she was my girlfriend. Answering another question, she admitted promising to marry me. The prosecutor, who had been studying a document in front of him, asked her rather sharply when our liaison had begun. She gave the date. He then observed with a would-be casual air that apparently she meant the day following my mother's funeral. After making this announcement, she asked Marie to give a full account of our doings on the day after my mother's funeral. Marie wouldn't answer at first, but the prosecutor insisted, and then she told him that we had met at the beach, gone together to the pictures, and then to my place.
Gentlemen of the jury, I would have you note that on the next day after his mother's funeral, that man was visiting the beach, starting a liaison with a girl, and going to see a comic film. That is all I wish to say.
Raymond was the next and last witness. He was then asked to make clear his relations with the deceased, and Raymond took this opportunity of explaining that it was he, not I, against whom the dead man had a grudge, because he, Raymond, had beaten up his sister. The judge asked him if the deceased had no reason to dislike me too. Raymond told him that my presence on the beach that morning was a pure coincidence. To which the prosecutor retorted that in this case, chance or mere coincidence seemed to play a remarkably large part. Was it by chance that I hadn't intervened when Raymond assaulted his mistress? Did this convenient term chance account for my having vouched for Raymond at the police station and having made, on that occasion, statements extravagantly favorable to him?
Not only did the man before you in the dock indulge in the most shameful orgies on the day following his mother's death, he killed a man cold-bloodedly, in pursuance of some sordid vendetta in the underworld of prostitutes and pimps. That, gentlemen of the jury, is the type of man the prisoner is.
The presiding judge had already started pronouncing the sentence to the effect that, in the name of the French people, I was to be decapitated in some public place. It seemed to me then that I could interpret the look on the faces of those present. It was one of almost respectful sympathy. I had stopped thinking altogether. I heard the judge's voice asking if I had anything more to say. After thinking for a moment, I answered no. Then the policeman led me out. Almost for the first time in many months, I thought of my mother. And now, it seemed to me, I understood why at her life's end she had taken on a fiancé. Why she'd played at making a fresh start. There, too, in that home where lives were flickering out, The dusk came as a mournful solace. With death so near, Mother must have felt like someone on the brink of freedom, ready to start life all over again. No one in the world had any right to weep for her, and I, too, felt ready to start life all over again. It was as if that great rush of anger had washed me clean, emptied me of hope, and, gazing up at the dark sky spangled with its signs and stars, for the first time, I laid my heart open to the benign indifference of the universe. To feel it so like myself, indeed so brotherly, made me realize that I'd been happy, and that I was happy still. For all to be accomplished, for me to feel less lonely, all that remained to hope was that on the day of my execution there should be a huge crowd of spectators, and that they should greet me with howls of execration.